December 4th, 2015. A hospital room in West Baltimore. The man in the bed weighed less than he had in 50 years. Cancer had hollowed him out, 73 years old. And the most feared heroin dealer the city had ever produced, the man who once moved kilos like other men moved grocery bags, closed his eyes for the last time. The official cause of death was cancer. The unofficial cause was a life, a long, brutal, brilliant, contradictory life. Melvin Douglas Williams was gone. This wasn't just another dead drug dealer. This was the man who quieted the Baltimore riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated. The man, a federal judge, sentenced to 34 years in prison. The man whose wiretap case became the blueprint for an entire genre of television. And the man who, in his 60s, walked onto an HBO set and played a preacher named The Deacon in a show that was secretly about his own life. His name was Little Melvin. And without him, there is no Avon Barksdale. There is no Stringer Bell. There is no Omar. There is no Bunk, no McNulty, no Wallace on the couch. There is no The Wire. This is the story of how a Baltimore detective, a Baltimore Sun reporter, and a Baltimore drug kingpin spent 20 years circling each other in the streets of West Baltimore. The wiretaps, the dead bodies, the payphones, the corner kids, the crooked politicians. They turned all of it into the greatest crime drama in American television history. But here's what the press releases never told you. The Wire wasn't fiction. It was a confession. A confession from all three men. And every character you loved on that show. Every one. Walked the streets of Baltimore long before HBO ever picked up the phone. Let's start with the Kingpin, because the Kingpin came first. Melvin Williams was born in Baltimore on December 14th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Week. His family lived in the shadow of Pennsylvania Avenue, the beating commercial heart of Black Baltimore in the 1950s. Jazz clubs, the Royal Theater, Cab Calloway played there. Billie Holiday played there, and on the sidewalks outside those clubs, a skinny kid with dark skin and darker eyes was learning how to hustle. They called him Little Melvin because he was small. They called him Slim because he was thin. They called him Black because he wore dark clothes every single day. Melvin was a pool shark before he was a drug dealer. He was a card player before he was a kingpin. By his early teens, he was beating grown men out of their paychecks in pool halls along the avenue. He had a gift. He could see patterns nobody else could see. Angles, probabilities, weaknesses in other men. He never raised his voice. He never had to. By the early 1960s, Melvin had transitioned from pool tables to heroin. Baltimore in 1964 was a heroin town. The port brought it in. The neighborhoods consumed it. And Melvin Williams figured out the supply chain. He cut deals with Italian wholesalers in New York. He built a distribution network across West Baltimore. He never carried a gun himself. He paid people for that. By the time he was 25 years old, Little Melvin Williams controlled the heroin trade along Pennsylvania Avenue. He had soldiers. He had stash houses. He had judges who took his calls. And then on April 4th, 1968, everything in Baltimore changed. Martin Luther King was murdered on a balcony in Memphis. By April 6th, Baltimore was on fire. Whole blocks of West Baltimore burning. National Guard troops in the streets. 6 people dead. 700 injured. Over 1,000 businesses looted. The governor of Maryland called in federal troops. The mayor was overwhelmed. And then a strange phone call went out. Baltimore officials, Black community leaders, they reached out to one man. They reached out to Little Melvin Williams. Because Melvin had something the mayor didn't have. Melvin had the streets. He walked through those burning neighborhoods. He talked to the rioters. He told them to go home. He brokered an uneasy peace. The fires died down. Some people in Baltimore have argued for 50 years that Melvin Williams personally helped end those riots. Other accounts are more skeptical. What's documented is this. Williams was viewed by city officials as someone with influence in the neighborhoods, and he used it. Then he went back to selling heroin, because that's who he was. Now we have to talk about the cop. Edward Burns was born in Baltimore in 1946, a working-class Irish Catholic kid. He went to the Army out of high school. The U.S. Army sent him to Vietnam. Burns served in the infantry. He worked in something called the Kit Carson Scout Program, which used former Viet Cong fighters as American scouts. Think about that. Burns spent a year of his life walking through jungles with men who had been trying to kill Americans the month before. He learned something in Vietnam. He learned that the official story is never the real story. He learned that the guys at the top send the guys at the bottom to die. He learned that intelligence work, real intelligence work, is about patience. Burns came home in the late 60s. He joined the Baltimore Police Department. 20 years on the force, homicide, narcotics. He developed a reputation for one thing: wiretaps. Burns understood that you couldn't catch a serious drug organization with hand-to-hand buys. The Kingpin never touches the drugs. The Kingpin never says the words. The Kingpin uses payphones and code. You had to listen for months, for years. And the man Ed Burns wanted to listen to most was Melvin Williams. The first time they collided was in the early 1980s. Burns had been chasing Williams for years. He'd lost him before. The story Melvin himself told later was that Burns chased him through the Maryland courts, the federal courts, and the state courts, and Melvin slipped every charge. He had lawyers, he had cash, he had patience of his own. But Burns had something Melvin didn't expect. Burns had the wire. Here's how the operation actually worked. The opportunity was payphones. Williams ran his entire organization through public payphones scattered across West Baltimore. He'd call from one phone. His lieutenant would call back from another. The codes changed weekly. Burns and his partner, a detective named Harry Edgerton, mapped every phone Williams used. The inside connection was simpler than you'd think. They worked sources. They flipped low-level corner kids. They watched the patterns of who picked up which phone at what time of day. The execution took years. Federal wiretap orders, translators for the slang, logs running into the thousands of pages. Burns and his team listened to Melvin Williams discuss heroin shipments for months. The money side. Williams was moving an estimated millions of dollars in heroin annually through his network. He had stash houses across West Baltimore. He had distribution as far as Philadelphia. And the problem, the reason it couldn't last, Williams trusted too many people. The wire didn't lie. The voices on the tape were the voices of his crew, and the crew said too much. On October 20th, 1984, federal agents and Baltimore detectives arrested Melvin Williams. In March of 1985, a federal judge sentenced him. Some accounts list the sentence as 24 years. Other accounts say 34 years. What's documented in the press at the time of his death is 34 years. Either way, little Melvin Williams was going away for a long time. And the case that put him there was a wiretap case. Ed Burns had finally caught his white whale. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is what came next. Because while Ed Burns was running wiretaps in West Baltimore, a young reporter at the Baltimore Sun was watching everything. His name was David Simon. He was born in 1960 in Washington, D.C., son of a journalist. He'd gone to the University of Maryland. He joined the Sun in 1982, 12 years on the city desk. Simon covered crime, not press conference crime, real crime. He rode with homicide detectives. He smoked cigarettes outside murder scenes at 3 a.m. He learned the language. He learned the rhythm. He learned the names. And one of the names he heard again and again was Ed Burns. Burns and Simon got to know each other. They argued, they drank, they respected each other, because both of them had figured out the same secret about Baltimore, the same secret about America. The drug war wasn't being lost. It was being run on autopilot. Stats got juiced, bodies got counted, kingpins got replaced by other kingpins within a week. And the people who actually lived in those neighborhoods got crushed underneath. In 1988, Simon took an unpaid leave from the Sunday. He embedded with the Baltimore Police Homicide Unit for a full year. He sat at their desks. He went on their calls. He drove with them at 3 in the morning to bodies on Druid Hill Avenue. He took notes on everything. The result was a book published in 1991. It was called Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets. It was over 600 pages of pure narrative nonfiction. It changed crime journalism. NBC turned it into a TV show called Homicide: Life on the Street, which ran for 7 seasons. Simon worked as a writer on the show. He learned television. But Simon wasn't done with Baltimore. Not even close. In 1993, Ed Burns retired from the police force. 20 years, he became a public school teacher in Baltimore. He taught middle school. He saw the same neighborhoods from a different angle now. He saw the kids. He saw what the drug war was doing to them, and he called David Simon. They made a pact. They were going to write a book together, not about the cops, about the corner, about the people who actually lived inside the drug trade. For a full year, in 1993, Simon and Burns parked themselves on a single street corner in West Baltimore, the corner of West Fayette Street and Monroe Street. They didn't take notes in front of people. They just stood there, day after day, week after week. They learned every face, the dealers, the fiends, the kids on the lookout for cops, the mothers trying to keep their sons out of the trade. They watched a 15-year-old named DeAndre McCullough deal vials of cocaine. They watched the corner kill people slowly. The book came out in 1997. It was called The Corner: A Year in the Life of an Inner-City Neighborhood. HBO turned it into a 6-part miniseries in 2000, which won 3 Emmys, including Outstanding Miniseries. Simon won an Emmy for writing it. Burns was a writer on the project. Now here's where it gets interesting, because 2000 was the year David Simon walked into HBO with an idea Ed Burns had been pushing for years. The idea was simple. What if you took everything we know, the wiretaps, the kingpins, the corner kids, the cops who care, the cops who don't, the politicians on the take, the unions dying, the schools failing, the newsrooms shrinking? What if you put it all in one show, and you didn't make any of it pretty? HBO said yes. Carolyn Strauss at HBO greenlit a pilot. David Simon delivered the pilot script in November 2001, 6 months after September 11th. America wasn't supposed to want a show like this. It wanted heroes. The Wire premiered on June 2, 2002, and it was a slow burn. Critics liked it. Audiences struggled with it. There were no easy answers. Nobody monologued about justice. The Kingpin had a code. The cop had a drinking problem. The little kid who saw too much. He didn't get saved. He got murdered on a couch. Here's the thing the audience didn't know. Almost every character on the show was based on a real person. Detective Jimmy McNulty was loosely based on at least 2 real Baltimore detectives Simon had ridden with. Bunk Moreland was based on a homicide detective named Oscar Recker. Cedric Daniels carried elements of a real commander. Proposition Joe drew from real Baltimore figures. Omar Little, the stick-up artist who robbed drug dealers, was inspired by a real Baltimore figure named Donnie Andrews, who actually worked as a consultant on the show and helped block out the scenes. But the big one, the center of the whole story, the Barksdale organization, was Melvin Williams. Avon Barksdale, the kingpin who runs West Baltimore from a strip club, the man with the soldiers, the man with the payphones, the man the Wire eventually catches. Avon Barksdale was little Melvin Williams. Burns had lived this case. He'd run those wires. He knew exactly how a Baltimore heroin organization actually operated, and he wrote it onto the page with the precision of a man who had spent years inside it. There were other inspirations. Avon's name itself reportedly came in part from another Baltimore figure, a man named Nathan Avon Barksdale, who had his own street legend. But the structure, the patterns. And while The Wire was being written and filmed in Baltimore between 2002 and 2008, Melvin Williams was actually getting out of federal prison. Williams had served his time. He was released in the early 2000s. He came home to a Baltimore that didn't look like the Baltimore he'd left. Pennsylvania Avenue was gone. The jazz clubs were gone. The corners were worse. Crack had ripped through the city in the late 80s while he was inside. Heroin was somehow even bigger, and the men running it were younger, dumber, and more violent than anything Melvin had ever been. David Simon and Ed Burns reached out to him. They knew his story. They knew their show was, in part, about him. They asked if he'd come on as a consultant. He said yes. Then they asked if he'd play a small role on the show. He said yes again. Starting in season 3, Melvin Williams played a character called the Deacon, a neighborhood church figure. A man who'd seen it all and now tried to broker peace between the streets and the institutions. It was almost unbearable to watch. The actual Baltimore Kingpin who inspired the entire show was now playing a redemption figure on that same show. Williams gave interviews around this time. He talked about the chase. He talked about Burns. In one interview, Williams said Burns had pursued him through every court in the state. He didn't sound bitter. He sounded almost grateful. Like the chase had ended his old life and given him a chance at a new one. Both men were old. Both men had survived. Both men understood something about the other that no civilian could ever understand. The Wire ran for 5 seasons. It ended in March 2008. It never won an Emmy for Outstanding Drama. Not one. The Academy didn't know what to do with it. It was too slow, too political, too black, too true. But critics now routinely call it one of the greatest television series ever made. Sociologists assign it in college classes. Harvard taught a course on it. The New York Times called it the best show in the history of television. And every season, the show grew larger. Season 1 was the drug war. Season 2 was the dying docks of working-class Baltimore. Season 3 was politics and reform. Season 4 was the schools. Burns, the former teacher, drove that season. The kids in Season 4 were composites of real students Ed Burns had taught in Baltimore middle schools. Wallace on the couch, Dookie pushing the cart, Randy in the group home. Those weren't writer's room inventions. Those were real children Burns had watched the system swallow whole. Season 5 was the newsroom, Simon's newsroom, Simon's career, Simon's grievance against the Baltimore Sunday. The whole show was a kind of love letter and indictment, written in the same breath. Now we have to talk about what happened to everyone. Melvin Williams died in December 2015 of cancer, 73 years old. The New York Times wrote his obituary. Deadline wrote his obituary. The Baltimore Afro-American wrote his obituary. The most feared heroin dealer in Baltimore history got the kind of dignified send-off usually reserved for civic leaders, because in some strange way he had become one. The man who once moved heroin by the kilo had moved the culture instead. The Heroin King of Baltimore, a documentary about his life, came out in 2017. Ed Burns is still alive. He kept writing. He co-created Generation Kill with Simon in 2008 about the Marines in Iraq. He worked on Show Me a Hero in 2015. He kept teaching ideas, even after he stopped teaching kids. David Simon kept building. He created Treme about post-Katrina New Orleans. He created The Deuce about 1970s New York pornography and the rise of HBO itself. He created We Own This City in 2022 about a Baltimore Police Department corruption scandal. We Own This City was, in a way, the sequel to The Wire that nobody asked for. The same city, the same problems, 20 years later. And the rot somehow was worse. What does the real story of The Wire actually reveal? It reveals that the drug war in America was never just a war on drugs. It was a war on a specific kind of neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood that surrounded Pennsylvania Avenue when Melvin Williams was a boy. The kind of neighborhood Ed Burns walked as a young cop. The kind of neighborhood David Simon stood on a corner of for a full year. The Wire didn't invent that critique. It documented it. It used a kingpin, a detective, and a reporter who had spent their lives on opposite sides of the same war, and it put them in the same writer's room, and it asked them to tell the truth. Because that's the secret The Wire wasn't fiction. It was journalism with a budget. It was memoir disguised as drama. It was three men in their 50s and 60s looking back at a city they all loved and all hurt, and trying to explain why none of it had to happen the way it did. Melvin Williams ran heroin for 30 years. Ed Burns chased him for 10. David Simon wrote about both of them for the rest of their lives. The streets that made them are still bleeding. The corners are still active. The kids on the couches are still getting killed. That's the real ending of The Wire. There is no ending. There's just the next season. And the next one. And the next one. Until somebody somewhere decides the war was never worth fighting in the first place. That's the real story from The Wire. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob and crime documentary every week. Drop a comment. Which Baltimore figure should we cover next? Avon Barksdale's real Pennsylvania Avenue, or Omar's real-life inspiration, Donnie Andrews? Tell us below.